when a woman carrying a thrift store portfolio walked into the most exclusive pitch competition in the Pacific Northwest, the room didn't go quiet out of respect. It went quiet the way rooms do when something unexpected and slightly embarrassing happens, the kind of silence that precedes polite dismissal. Nobody expected what she was carrying inside that worn leather case. Nora Calloway had spent 38 years becoming invisible to people like the ones in that room. She knew how to read a space the moment she stepped into it. The angle of shoulders, the quality of fabric, the particular way wealthy people looked past you without technically looking away. She had been looked past her entire life, and she had learned, slowly and at considerable cost, to stop apologizing for it. The Pacific Coast Innovation Summit drew the best-funded startups in the country. Held every year at the Hargrove Center in Seattle, it was the kind of event where registration badges came with embedded chips, and the coffee was single origin, and nobody mentioned the cost of anything, because mentioning cost was itself a kind of social failure. Nora's badge had been printed on a slightly different stock than the others. She noticed this because she noticed everything, and it listed her company as Calloway Textiles, which told the people around her exactly nothing useful and also, somehow, everything they needed to know about how seriously to take her. She had driven 4 hours from Medford, Oregon, in a 2009 Civic with a cracked dashboard and a check engine light that had been on for 2 years without incident. Her daughter Petra sat in the passenger seat, 11 years old, and already doing mental math about how much the parking would cost. "That's $18, Petra said when they pulled into the structure attached to the Hargrove Center. "I know, for one day, I know, Petra. That's more than your fabric rolls cost per yard. Thank you for that comparison." Petra wasn't wrong. She rarely was. She had her father's precision with numbers and her mother's refusal to pretend those numbers didn't matter. Nora had raised her mostly alone since David's accident 4 years ago. A warehouse collapse that had taken his mobility first, and then, 18 months later, his life, in the slow, grinding way that grief and medical debt and a body that couldn't repair itself took things. What it had left behind was Petra, and the house in Medford, and the workshop behind the house where Nora had spent those same 4 years building something she couldn't fully explain to anyone who hadn't lost something irreplaceable. They took the elevator to the lobby. The moment the doors opened, Petra's hand found Nora's without either of them acknowledging it. The lobby of the Hargrove Center looked like the inside of a tech company's fever dream. Clean lines, reclaimed wood, enormous screens cycling through the logos of presenting companies. Most of those logos were geometric and minimal and communicated in the silent language of branding that their owners understood the aesthetic of money. Nora's logo, hand-lettered in a style her daughter described as kind of old-timey, communicated something different. She wasn't sure yet whether that was a problem. The registration desk was staffed by 2 young women in matching linen blazers. The one who processed Nora's badge looked at the company name, then at the Thrift-Store portfolio, then back at the badge with an expression of careful professional neutrality. "You're in the materials innovation category," she said. "Presentations start at 2. You'll have 12 minutes to present, then 8 for questions from the panel." "Thank you. Just so you're aware." The woman hesitated in the way people do when they're trying to be kind about something unkind. "The materials category this year is quite competitive. We have entries from Synthex Labs, from the Kellerman Group, from 3 university research partnerships, so just manage your expectations." Nora smiled. "I will." She had been managing her expectations for 38 years. She was exceptionally good at it. They found seats in the main atrium, and Petra immediately pulled out a notebook and started writing things down. Observations about the room, the people, the ratio of men to women, the number of attendees who were looking at their phones versus looking at the presentation screens. She did this everywhere. Nora had stopped asking why because the answer was always some version of, "I want to understand the system," and that was the kind of answer that made a mother proud and slightly terrified in equal measure. "That woman keeps looking at us," Petra said without raising her eyes from the notebook. Nora followed the direction of Petra's attention. Across the atrium, near a cluster of people in the kind of coordinated clothing that suggested corporate backing, stood a woman who had the particular quality of someone accustomed to being the most capable person in any room. She was maybe 40, with dark hair cut cleanly and the focused posture of someone running calculations about everything around her. Her name badge read Victoria Hadel, CEO Hadel Manerial Sciences. Her company logo was on 2 of the screens. Victoria was looking at Nora the way Nora had seen executives look at things they didn't recognize, not with contempt exactly, but with the specific interest of someone trying to categorize a variable they hadn't accounted for. Then she started walking toward them. Nora considered turning away. She had promised herself 3 years ago, in the workshop at 2 in the morning, with David's photograph on the shelf above the workbench, that she was done turning away from things. So she stood still. Victoria stopped a few feet away. Up close, she was sharper, more precise, the kind of person whose attention felt like a physical pressure. Callaway Textiles, she said. It wasn't a greeting. It was a statement of information being filed. That's right. Victoria's eyes moved to the portfolio, then to Petra, then back to Nora. You drove here? 4 hours. From where, Medford? Something shifted in Victoria's expression, not pity, not quite. More like the recalibration of an assumption. I'm familiar with the materials category competitors. I don't recognize your company. We're small, Nora said. How small? 2 employees. Myself and, periodically, my daughter. She gestured at Petra, who looked up from the notebook and regarded Victoria with the calm, evaluating gaze of an 11-year-old who had learned early that adults could not always be trusted to behave logically. Victoria's mouth curved slightly. It wasn't warmth, not yet, but it wasn't dismissal either. And what exactly does Callaway Textiles make? A fabric. That's a broad category. Yes. Victoria waited for elaboration. Nora didn't provide any. She had learned that lesson from David, who had always said that the best thing you could do with a strong hand was make the other person ask to see it. Victoria tilted her head. The materials category exists to showcase meaningful advances in performance textiles, composite materials, sustainable manufacturing processes. The presentations are evaluated by engineers and industry specialists who have seen most of what's out there. What you're implying about your fabric? I'm not implying anything, Nora said. I'm presenting this afternoon. There was a beat of silence. Behind Victoria, 2 men in Hale Material Sciences lanyards were watching the exchange with the carefully arranged expressions of people trying to look like they weren't watching. All right, Victoria said. Her tone had the quality of someone choosing not to push on something. Good luck. She turned and walked back toward her group. One of the men said something Nora couldn't hear, and Victoria shook her head slightly. Not agreement, but not disagreement either. Petra watched this with the focused attention she brought to things she found interesting. Is she going to be a problem? I don't know yet, Nora said. She looked at your portfolio like it was a liability. Most people do. Petra went back to her notebook. Nora found them lunch, sandwiches from a vendor cart, $12 each, which Petra logged in her notebook without comment, and they sat near the windows overlooking the water and waited. The afternoon light came through gray and flat, the way Pacific Northwest light did in March, and it made the convention center feel both enormous and somehow manageable. Are you scared? Petra asked. A little. Dad used to say being scared means you're paying attention. The mention landed the way it always did, unexpected, physical, somewhere in the center of the chest. Nora had stopped bracing for it. The grief didn't lessen so much as it changed shape, became something she carried differently than she had in the beginning. He said that when he was learning to drive a forklift, Nora said. He was terrified of forklifts. Petra smiled. Did the fabric work? When I tested it. Then it doesn't matter what that woman thinks. Out of the mouths of 11-year-olds. The presentations for the materials category were held in Conference Room B, which was smaller than the main hall, but still large enough to feel formal. A panel table at the front, rows of chairs filling quickly with industry observers, a journalist or 2 with recorders. Nora found 2 seats near the back and set her portfolio on her lap. Victoria Hale was already in the front row. She didn't look back. The first 2 presentations were exactly what the registration desk had implied. Polished, well-funded, backed by slides that had clearly been designed by professionals. Synthex Labs presented a moisture-wicking composite for athletic gear. The Kellerman Group showed a fire-resistant material for aerospace application. Both received engaged questions from the 5-person panel. Both presenters were men in good suits who moved through their material with the easy confidence of people who had practiced in front of mirrors and coaches. Then Nora was called. She stood, took Petra's hand briefly, squeezed it, let go. Petra gave her the look. The same look David used to give her before anything difficult, steady and certain, and a little fierce. The walk to the front of the room felt very long. The panel looked up as she arrived, and she watched it happen. The same recalibration she'd seen on Victoria's face earlier. The portfolio, the flannel shirt she'd worn because it was practical, and she'd forgotten to think about appearances, the absence of a team or a badge indicating corporate affiliation. Mrs. Callaway, the panel chair said, please proceed whenever you're ready. Nora set the portfolio on the table and opened it. Inside were fabric samples in various weights and treatments, lab test results from the Oregon State Materials Science Department, and handwritten technical notes that she had spent 3 years accumulating in notebooks that still smelled faintly of the workshop. 4 years ago, she said, my husband died. We had a daughter, a house with a mortgage, and about $60,000 in medical debt from the 18 months before he died. I had a background in textile manufacturing. I'd worked in production for 12 years before we had Petra, and a workshop behind the house with equipment that was worth slightly more than the debt. The room was very quiet. I didn't start working on the fabric because I had a vision for disrupting the materials industry. I started because I needed a problem I could solve, and I needed to solve it in a space I already understood. The textile industry has a heat management problem that's been treated as an engineering challenge for 30 years and hasn't been adequately solved. I thought I knew why, because everyone was trying to solve it at the fiber level when the actual issue was structural. The way the threads interact with each other under thermal stress, not the properties of the threads themselves. She passed the first sample down the panel. It looked unremarkable, a medium-weight fabric in a neutral gray that could have been mistaken for any number of technical textiles on the market. What you're holding is a woven composite that maintains structural integrity and breathability across a temperature range from -40 to 400 degrees Fahrenheit. No degradation in tensile strength at either extreme. Thermal conductivity that adjusts passively based on the differential between surface and body temperature. She paused. I know how that sounds. The panel chair held up the sample and looked at it. Where was this tested? Oregon State Materials Science Department. I can provide full documentation. I drove there in October with a trunk full of samples and paid for the testing myself. $1,600 I'd been saving since July. The woman on the panel, a textile engineer from Portland, based on the program notes, leaned forward. This weave pattern is unusual. The secondary threading angle. It's a modification of a 19th century military weaving technique, Nora said. There's a reference in an 1887 Army Corps of Engineers textile manual that I found at a university library. Nobody had applied it to modern synthetic fiber blends because there was no obvious reason to assume it would scale. I had a reason. What reason? I kept failing with everything else and I needed to try something different. A few people in the audience laughed. Genuine laughter, surprised out of them. The panel continued. Questions came faster and with more focus than they had for either previous presentation. Nora answered each one without notes, because the answers were inside her the way anything is inside you when you've spent 4 years thinking about almost nothing else. She talked about weave density calculations and thermal stress distribution and the specific failures of the 63 prototypes she'd made before the 64th worked the way she'd needed it to. At the back of the room, she could see Petra sitting completely still, watching. Toward the end of the question period, the man at the end of the panel, he had a Kellerman Group badge, an industry observer rather than a judge, raised his hand. The panel chair nodded at him, a small accommodation. Mrs. Calloway, he said. His tone was cordial in the way that sometimes precedes something that isn't. The performance claims you're making are significant. Extraordinary, really, if the testing holds up. And we've had situations before in competitions like this where, he paused, arranged his words carefully, where independently developed materials have turned out to have interesting relationships with proprietary research being conducted by established firms. The room went still in a different way than before. I'm not suggesting anything improper, he continued, suggesting exactly that. I'm simply noting that the thermal management approach you've described shares certain conceptual territory with research directions that are known to be active in the industry. Given that you're a sole operator with no institutional affiliation, it might be reasonable to ask how we can be confident this work is genuinely independent. Nora had known something like this might happen. She had talked to a patent attorney in December. One pro bono consultation, 40 minutes on the phone, the attorney's voice careful and measured as she explained what exposure looked like in the materials tool space. I've been working in my workshop in Medford, Oregon, for 4 years, Nora said. Her voice was level. I have dated notebooks going back to the first week after my husband's funeral. I have receipts for every material purchase, every equipment repair, every library trip. I have 63 documented failed prototypes with dates and specifications. I have correspondence with the Oregon State Department going back 2 years. If any established firm can demonstrate that their proprietary research preceded my documented development process, I welcome that comparison. She met the man's eyes. But I'll note that I'm the one who drove 4 hours to be here, and I'm the one who paid $1,600 for independent testing, and I'm the one who built this in a workshop next to a house where I've been raising my daughter alone for 4 years. If you have a specific claim to make it specifically. The Kellerman observer sat back. His expression hadn't changed, but something in his posture had. The panel chair cleared his throat. Thank you, Ms. Calloway. You may step down. The panel will deliberate and announce results at 4 o'clock. She walked back to her seat. Petra was watching her with the expression she made when she was working hard not to show how worried she'd been. That man was unfair, Petra said quietly. Yes, he didn't have anything real. He was just throwing something. That's how it works sometimes. That's stupid. Yes, Nora agreed. It really is. They sat through the remaining 2 presentations, which Nora barely heard. Her mind kept running back through her answers, testing them for weakness the way she tested fabric samples for stress points. She found nothing she wished she'd said differently, which was either a good sign or evidence that she was too close to her own work to evaluate it clearly. At 3:30, a woman in a Hargrove Center lanyard approached their row. Mrs. Calloway, there's someone who'd like to speak with you before the results are announced. Conference room down the hall. The someone was Victoria Hale. She was alone in the small conference room, standing near the window with her arms crossed, not defensively, but in the way of someone thinking hard about something. When Nora came in, she turned, and her expression was different than it had been in the atrium. The sharpness was still there, but something underneath it had shifted. I'll be direct, Victoria said. Please. I watched your presentation. I've been in this industry for 15 years, and I've seen every variation of the thermal management problem attempted, and I've never seen that weave approach. She paused. Why haven't you published? If this holds up under independent verification, this should be in a journal. I didn't know how to navigate that process, Nora said. I'm not affiliated with a university. I'm not sure any journal would take a submission from a woman in Medford with a community college background and no institutional backing. Victoria's jaw tightened slightly. That's a fair assessment of how the system works, and an appalling comment on the system. Yes. The man who spoke up during your questions, I didn't send him to do that. I want to be clear about that. I believe you. Victoria looked at her steadily. Do you? You were sitting in the front row the whole time. If you'd wanted to derail me, you had better options. Something that might have been a smile moved across Victoria's face and vanished. The Kellerman Group has been working on a thermal management composite for 2 years. They've spent about $4 million on it. Their results are not as good as yours. Nora didn't say anything. What I'm telling you, Victoria said, is that you walked into this room with a portfolio from a thrift store and a fabric sample that outperforms what a team of engineers with multi-million-dollar backing has spent 2 years trying to achieve. That's either going to make this your moment or it's going to make you a target, and I think you're smart enough to know which is more likely without the right protection. I've been talking to a patent attorney. Good. Have you talked to anyone about commercialization? No. Victoria unfolded her arms. I want to make you an offer. Not today, not until results are announced and you've had time to think. But I want you to know that Hale Materials Sciences is interested in a partnership arrangement, not an acquisition. I'm not trying to buy your process and bury it. I'm talking about a licensing structure that keeps you in control of your intellectual property while giving you access to manufacturing capacity and distribution that you can't build in 4 years in a workshop in Medford. Nora studied her. Why are you telling me this before the results? Victoria was quiet for a moment. Because I've spent 15 years competing by being better than everyone else in the room, and this afternoon I watched someone do something I've been trying to solve for a year, and she did it in a workshop next to a house where she's raising a kid alone, and she did it because she needed a problem she could solve. She stopped. I know what that feels like. Not the exact circumstances, but she seemed to choose her next word carefully, the necessity of it. Building something because there's no alternative, because sitting still would be worse than the building. Nora waited. My company almost failed in its 3rd year, Victoria said. Not for lack of good science, for lack of money, and because I didn't know how to navigate the parts of the business that weren't science, and because 3 separate firms tried to undercut me with acquisition offers that were actually designed to shelve my research. I survived because someone helped me understand the difference between an offer that would protect my work and one that would erase it. She met Nora's eyes. I'd like to be that person for you if you're open to it. There was a long silence. Through the window, the gray Seattle light had shifted toward the particular quality of late afternoon. I need to think about it, Nora said. Of course, and I need to talk to my daughter. Victoria looked at her for a moment. She's remarkable, by the way. She didn't move the entire time you were presenting. She gets that from her father. Victoria nodded, a small motion that suggested she understood more than she acknowledged, and let Nora go. The panel announced results at 4 o'clock. Nora and Petra were in the 3rd row when the panel chair took the microphone. Petra had stopped writing in her notebook. She was holding Nora's hand with both of hers, the way she had when she was smaller. In 12 years of chairing this panel, the judge said, "I have never seen a unanimous decision in the materials category. This year we have one." He looked up. The award for materials innovation goes to Nora Calloway of Calloway Textiles for the development of an adaptive thermal composite that represents a genuinely novel approach to a problem this industry has been attempting to solve for 3 decades. Petra made a sound that was not quite crying and not quite laughing. The walk to the front of the room felt shorter than it had before. Nora accepted the award, a plaque and a check for $20,000, enough to cover the rest of the medical debt with something left over, enough to breathe differently for the first time in 4 years, and stood at the podium while photographs were taken and said the only thing that felt true. "My husband believed I could build things I wasn't sure I was capable of building. He was usually right. This is for him and for our daughter, who never once asked me to stop trying." In the audience, Petra was wiping her eyes with the back of her hand, clearly annoyed at herself for doing so. Afterward, the room reorganized itself into the informal networks of people who had business to discuss. Several people approached Nora with cards and carefully worded interest. The Kellerman observer was nowhere to be seen. Victoria found her near the door as the crowd thinned and shook her hand without the careful distance of their first meeting. "Call me when you're ready," Victoria said. "There's no urgency. Take whatever time you need. I'll need a good attorney present. I'd expect nothing less." They drove home in the dark, the Civic's check engine light glowing its faithful orange in the dash. Petra fell asleep somewhere past Olympia, her head against the window and her notebook open in her lap. Nora drove through the quiet stretch of I-5 with the award on the back seat and $20,000 worth of check in her portfolio, and the strange, disorienting sensation of something having changed in a way she didn't yet know how to measure. She called the patent attorney the next morning. She explained what had happened, described Victoria's offer in as much detail as she could remember, and listened while the attorney told her what to watch for and what to ask, and what a partnership that protected her would look like versus one that didn't. Then she called her neighbor Ruth, who had been watching the house, and told her they were home. "I heard you won something," Ruth said. "Yes, David would be so pleased." Nora stood in the workshop doorway with her coffee and looked at the equipment that had been her company and her grief and her purpose for 4 years, and she said quietly to the room and to the photograph on the shelf above the workbench, "I kept trying. I didn't stop." She spent the next 2 weeks reviewing Victoria's formal partnership proposal with the attorney, who confirmed what Nora had suspected. The terms were more favorable than expected, structured to maintain her ownership, her approval rights, her control over what happened to the fabric she'd built in the dark. She signed in April. Petra was there, sitting in the corner of the conference room with her notebook, drawing something in the margins of the page. When Nora set down the pen, Petra looked up. "Is it done?" "It's done." "What happens now?" "I don't know exactly, but we'll figure it out." Petra nodded as though this were sufficient, and perhaps Nora thought for an 11-year-old who had watched her mother build something extraordinary out of necessity and grief and the refusal to stop trying it was. Perhaps certainty wasn't the thing that made a life. Perhaps it was just this, the willingness to keep going, workshop light on past midnight, hands moving through the work, one problem at a time. The check engine light was still on in the Civic when they drove home. Nora had stopped being bothered by it years ago. Some things kept running even when every warning said they shouldn't. She knew, better than most, that this could be enough.